Welcome everybody to this panel on workflow. My name is Christian Schurman. I work at Microsoft as a director of program management in the Expression Group. We make tools for designers. We hope to help designers to make great user experiences. And oops, this runs much faster than it's supposed to. Back to that. Before we start, I would like my dear fellow panelists to introduce themselves and to say a little bit about who they are and who they work for and what type of projects they are working on. And then hopefully we get into a lively discussion about workflow. So Robbie, why don't you start?
Okay, my name is Robbie Ingebrigtsen, and I am the Director of Creative Development for a company called Identity Mine. And Identity Mine is a kind of an interesting company. We do both development and design. In fact, we'll be talking about how we pull that off, I guess. So strong focus on development, though, and on especially development with WPF and Silverlight, so the Microsoft technologies. Let's see, I like to stand, so I requested not to have a chair, although I think that they're going to force me to have one, so eventually I may get one. Formerly on the WPF team at Microsoft, so I did a lot of work at Microsoft to help create the WPF platform. And then now I mostly just get to create cool stuff. So
cool. Ryan?
Hi, Ryan Lane, digital strategist with Wonderman. We have a larger marketing company that's worldwide. We do a lot of work with Microsoft. I specifically work with the Silverlight team and the MSCom, Microsoft.com teams. So we've been doing a lot with Silverlight lately and trying to figure out how to work with the latest technology to bring it to all their online activities. So the majority of the work I do kind of fits right in the middle and kind of that integration role I do with my background's in design and development, so often I'm asked to make the things work together.
Mark?
Hey, that's not me. That's not me. That's me.
That's you.
Mark Ligamary. I'm an executive creative director down in Austin, Texas at Frog Design. Frog's a multidiscipline design studio, consultancy. Been around for like 40 years, so in terms of consultancies, we're ancient. But we've been working with these technologies for about 3.5 years now. I oversee the entire creative team down in Austin, so that's interaction designers and visual designers and brand designers. But I look at software design and software process across all our studios. And I've been there for 3 years. Before that, I was at Microsoft for like 8 years or 6 years. So.
Cool. Ken?
My name is Ken Azuma from Second Factory, Japan. My job role is senior experience architect, and who that combines technologies and designing things like a group. I wrote a book about the expression brand. I'm doing some public speaking in Japan many times, but it's my first time with English speaking, so can I ask a favor? Please speak slowly for me, okay? That's it.
Marcelo?
All right, I'm Marcelo Maurer. I'm Vice President of User Experience at Avenue A Razorfish in New York. I've been working in this field for a long time, but in the web space for the last 9 to 10 years. And there's one thing that I usually tell people that is sort of like extemporaneous, is I actually have a degree in philosophy. And the way I got to this is about thinking about how things can be clear to people, and that's what I've been engaged on. So one of the challenges I have in working with people is how passing of information to one group of people who don't speak the same language that others do. And that's the challenge that we have when we're talking about workflow, is how people pass knowledge to other people, and that's fundamentally a problem that I'm trying to solve in our shop, but I think it's a problem that the industry at large is suffering right now.
And I'm Robert Tuttle, technical architect at Frog Design. I'm Mark's partner in crime, if you will. I oversee kind of the technology tracks of WPF and Silverlight and other types of engagements, primarily in relationship to the interaction designers and visual designers on a project. We have design technologists and developers that I'm kind of keeping tabs on throughout the workflow. So this is a especially important topic and something that we've been experimenting with for several years. That's good.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So before we get started discussing, I would like to have you participate a little bit and just ask you a few questions. How many of you in the audience are designers? So how many of you do visual design, information design, interaction design? Let's start with visual design. Information design? Interaction design? How many are developers? Oh, cool. Great. So we have a good mix of people. One more question. What type of organizations do you work in? How many of you work in design shops, like design boutiques, organizations like Frog or the like? How many work in enterprise-style development environments? And how many in ISV style? Okay, oh, got a good mix. Great. So one last question, and then we get started to do some of the work here. How many of you do web development and desktop development? Oh, wow, good mix, great. So what we want to talk about is workflow. So how do we get designers and developers to work happily together and to create great results and to create great user experiences? And so we have here a pretty good variety of people on the panel. So I want to start right with you, Robbie, because you're right left to me. How do you guys do it?
Okay. Well, it's a big question. So we've taken an approach which involves a role we call the integrator. So I guess, fine, I'll sit. So our team is made up of 3 primary roles. The development team at Identity Mind has 3 primary roles. Here, I'll scoot in a little bit so you can see when I talk. So we have the sort of traditional developer and designer roles, which you're all hopefully familiar with, right? The roles that Christian was just asking about. And then we have a 3rd role, which we call integrator. And so integrator is a term. Actually, it turns out that a lot of people use this term. We're finding out that it's kind of a fairly well-accepted term. But the integrator is a guy who has the passion about all things visual and interactive that a designer would have. So he brings maybe that experience to the table. Maybe it comes from an art school or something like that. But he also has the technical understanding that maybe a developer would bring to the table. And typically, so in an ideal world, an integrator would have both of these sort of to the an optimum level. So he would be the best developer on the team potentially, and the best designer on the team potentially. He just happens to be able to marry those two talents. It's not always the case, though. We have guys that are coming from a design side who also have a passion for technical things and have kind of honed their skills that way, and vice versa. We have guys coming from the technical side who are passionate about UI. And typically, the role of this person is not a passive role. So that's an important thing to understand. I think a lot of times when we talk about integration, people have this sense that integration is, cutting up Photoshop files or something like that. So it's not a person who's necessarily, passive, but very, very active. And a lot of times he's even doing things like almost at an architectural level. So he's coming up with, a plan for how we would implement a particular interaction or a plan for how we would achieve a particular visual style or component of the application in a way that meets a performance bar. So he's a guy that can take both the visual and the design aspects into account as well as the technical aspects into account. So he kind of, I guess, greases the wheels between the developer and the designer. And typically, this actually works really well for us. I mean, it scales well. Typically, we have a ratio of like 1 of these guys to maybe 2 designers and 2 developers or something like that. So it scales well, and it just kind of keeps things smooth. So in terms of simplifying the workflow, this is a guy who has the big picture and can really do that. Like he'll make the workflow simple.
So does anybody of you want to pick that up?
The problem that I'm really struggling with in our shop is that we're big. We have lots of people working. We're very specialized. And there's information architects, content strategists, designers, interaction designers, creative directors, developers. Developers work in Flash, developers work in Silverlight, developers work in Ajax, and then there's a bunch of flavors. So it's very hard sometimes to create things from a conceptual standpoint and how they actually get carried over from the inception, from the beginning of an idea all the way down to execution. And one of the challenges that we have is that we don't think there's good software in the beginning on the concepting, ideating part of the process. A lot of the software actually tends to be towards the end of the process, in which people really, when the ideas are more solidified, when the visual assets are more solid, but there is very little in the beginning of the process. things that allow us to represent visually what we mean to a client, and without involving all those people, the information architect, the content strategist, the designer, and so on and so forth. So how can we actually do good prototyping that it has high fidelity many times because it's necessary in a fairly quick and cheap way. One that gives flexibility to people on a very conceptual level without having to resort to design libraries or development libraries. How can we do this for people like me who does not speak a complex language in development and code? So what kinds of tools can you give me that enable me to do that kind of rapid prototyping without telling me that I have to do this in some sort of paper prototyping format? How can I capture movement? That's one of the biggest challenges we have right now is how do we capture movement in these sort of early prototype formats. So in a nutshell, that's the challenge as I see it from the standpoint of concepting and ideating and pushing this towards the more sort of solid development side of things.
So that's a great...
I'll chime in.
Chime in.
Okay. On that, actually, I wasn't thinking that was all the part we're talking about, but it actually is, now that I think of our problem. And the way, there is no one tool for that, you're right. And we have approached it on our groups by changing process a little bit. And we've been doing it for about a year now, maybe 2 years, the change in process, where we've actually, we've moved away from the supermen. Microsoft calls these people diviners, and generally don't believe in them. They're great if you can find them, but good luck keeping them, and they don't scale. So we've actually changed our process a little bit to enable this prototyping and thing. And what we've done is instead of think about it, draw some pictures of it, show it to somebody, then spend a year building it. We've started all those things basically at once.
Yep.
And this has been super scary for our internal teams and super scary for clients that we work with. It doesn't necessarily mean also that we are done at the end of 6 weeks. We're not about building 6-week cool prototypes. We make software. This stuff takes a couple of years sometimes. But the idea is we don't really have this discrete prototyping kind of phase. We start iterative development as soon as possible. And for a design company, that's pretty different than what we've traditionally done. We're very different.
And we are experiencing exactly what you're experiencing. It is a very funny, maybe it's not a coincidence, that it's been about 1.5 to 2 years we're trying to experiment moving away with the so-called waterfall process to a more iterative, learning from your mistakes kind of approach that is a little humbler, but sometimes more expensive too. So the pushback is not only from the clients, but also from people who are managing the relationship with the client, project managers, and what we call our account people, our client partners. So the client doesn't want to pay more. We need the flexibility to be wrong, to do things, that are not necessarily like the 100% tested and solid.
So another thing that I've heard from many people, who like to do iterative agile development is that if you start immediately to do iterative agile development, is you already take on constraints that come from the fact that you actually develop something that you don't have when you actually do conceptual prototyping outside the environment of real code or of real deliverables, when you basically work in a paper space. How do you deal with that?
We don't, We try our best. And sometimes it's about bringing, the problem right now is that we end up having to bring a lot of people who have different skills because we don't have the Superman either. So the diviner, it's in short, and if there's any diviners here, just talk to me at the end of this.
Call me, we stop.
Call me, great opportunities for diviners. And so the question is, at the end of the day, how many people does it take to screw, with a light bulb? That's the joke, It's the same thing, It's the same, how do we actually do something in an optimal, engaging way without driving everybody crazy?
I think I'll give some pushback on the diviner role. And I championed it. I loved it, People, let's put it this way, people come to our company, we're sort of this prestigious design firm. They're coming for the best of, like the absolute best visual designer, the absolute most incredible interaction designer, the person who's with the most experience in web architecture, the devs who know the best how to do an interface layer. they're not coming for sort of somebody who's a jack of all trades. They're wanting, like, so we assemble teams to solve that. We do have the problem of how do we concert all that work, right? Because, you know, we've been pushing, okay, let's pull all those people together, they're the best of, and let's do them, you know, concurrent, let's run all the disciplines at the same time. Well, who can manage that? You know, that's like 7 people running on their own. How are we going to control scope, et cetera?
And so find like who leads that effort.
Yeah, so what we've done is we've pulled up and we said, well, it's not the person pulling those things together isn't, you know, this diviner role. It's sort of it's a person who guides the overall UX, and it can be a different discipline each time. Sometimes it can be a technologist, you know, who can sort of say, I understand this program, and I'm going to guide it for the next, you know, quarter. Other times it's a designer, it's a creative director that pull that together. Right. But it's at a higher level. We call it sort of a training wheels approach. So we sort of jump into something. We have somebody who's done it before. We have the experts. And, you know, when we get to a point, there's some point where that UX director is able to peel away because the team is self-running.
That's actually not far off from what we do. In fact, a scenario that comes up a lot with us is we will we'll be hired by a company like an enterprise to go in and help them, you know, solve a particular software problem. And a lot of times what we see happening is that they've got some internal design resources and they've got some internal developer resources, and they have this exact same problem of trying to get people kind of coordinating their efforts, like you're saying. And typically what we do is we encourage them to elect an integrator, right? And we call it an integrator. I think that it's the same kind of thing, though. And in that case, it's somebody who's either coming from a design background or from a developer background, or even it might be somebody at a management level. But this is a person, typically, you know, we'll assign tasks to them that are kind of at an integration level. But I think I'm with you in that if there's other people that can handle those tasks, that's fine. I totally agree, though, that you need to have somebody that's coordinating what's happening at the UX level and, you know, understands that if we want this effect, we need to have, you know, this component or this developer implement it, or, you know, you've got to have somebody coordinating that.
Yeah, because it's, and the other role that person has, the reason we make it a senior person is
that makes sense.
That by going with, it's a lot of this, it is new technology, a lot of times it is the V1 of the thing. Like people are coming to us a lot of times for their first implementation of something or their big giant redo of the thing that they've hated for 10 years. So like, and when we start proposing this wackier process where we're going to run all these disciplines at once and we're going to try to have something in a few weeks, it is chaos, you know, like it's internal chaos to sort of watch it happen. And from a client perspective, it can be super scary. You know, they're sort of watching these builds sort of mangle their way, you know, to establishment. So that UX director is there to sort of control the chaos as it's sort of moving from phase to phase.
So, Mark, I was just, I mean, I actually, when we had this conversation, this panel idea started like 3 or 4 months ago. We had this meeting and everybody started talking about the same things. And then one of the things that this challenge that we have right now, that, you know, iteration is here, but I was just sort of wondering, when did it start and why did it start? You know, what are the triggers for that? Is it introduction of movement? Is it boredom because we're tired of waterfall? Is it the fact that waterfall just made things just too stale? What are the drivers? And I'm asking other people as well, you know, why do you think this is actually happening and happening in sort of concurrent fashion across the industry?
It seems like from my experience, we saw it coming out of the development teams first. Like they were the first ones to adopt it. It worked better for their efforts. And then it really was the UX and the design that had to figure out, well, how do we integrate into that? Because it really works for them. And then how did we kind of like start to work within those cycles? So as far as how it evolved, it kind of came about that way.
I think a lot of the workflow problems that we're facing right now are also just a result of the sort of the level of UI that people are trying to implement nowadays. I mean, we're like you mentioned motion. I think just in general interaction is a lot more demanding now, and we're you know, and it does involve the coordinating of more disciplines than it used to. You know, when we were first doing web stuff, I say we, like I was actually doing. I was still in college, but or high school maybe. But you know, in early days of the web, you know, even the UI was just a lot of it was cutting up bitmaps and that kind of thing. And I think, you know, a lot of the pushback we get from the integrator role is related to the fact that people think of the integrator role as a guy who's, you know, slicing up bitmaps.
They're not?
They're not.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not slicing bitmap. And
JPEGs.
But
JPEGs.
Well, yeah. Pings now. But the point is, like, the level of experience that we're trying to deliver has evolved to where you really have to coordinate these disciplines. You have, you know, developers participating and designers participating.
How do you, on your end, actually deal with the flexibility? Because what we are asking here is at the conceptual level is we have lots of ideas, we want to try different things.
Yeah.
The further down you go in the quote-unquote workflow, the more there is a need for things to be more stable. There's less change. So how do you deal with that? I want to change. I want to try different things. What's the trade-off?
You mean iteration within the project? So you get 6 months into the project, and now you want to...
Well, 5.5.
Well, that's 5.5 on a 6-month project.
That's a great question because the challenge really fluctuates where you are in the process. Early in discovery and research and development, it's usually a combination of the visual and interaction designers pushing on the technologist to say, hey, I really want to be able to do this, and the technologist looking for opportunities to create that innovation. What we've, Mark was talking about, we've kind of changed it to be integration by committee. So the integrator is more of a virtual organization made up of your visual and interaction designer and then the technologist. Where we've seen a kind of a trend in the last few projects that we've worked on is that there's a point in time where there's a flip where it's the visual or the design creative people running the show, running the asylum, and then it's the technologists that have to come in and take over. And the way that we've envisioned this is you have wireframes, you have visual comps, you have maybe After Effects, motion studies, etc. And you've got your visual designer, interaction designer, your technologists all looking at that same material. But they're looking at it in totally different terms. Like from a technologist point of view, I'm looking at it, okay, how do I deconstruct this to make these data bindable components that scale well, that perform well, whereas the interaction designer is just looking at movement and they don't even look at it at a control level, right, or a composite control level. And really what we found is it really takes all of those different perspectives to push on each other to come up with the result that's right. And whether it's one person who's a Superman or a committee of people, the end result is you have to have enough eyes and enough iterations on it to really prove it out. And so it's that flip point that's really crucial in these types of projects.
Yeah, I can see that. Ken, how do you guys in Second Factory deal with that?
Can you show my team model now?
Sure.
Slide?
Yeah, slide.
That's cheating.
Allowing by Japanese. So that this is our team model. I'd like to talk about one by one. PM is a product manager. It is a kind of top-down management than you guys, US way. And PM has superpower of the project. and XA means experience architect. And that word, director or technical director, is if we are the team for the movie making, product manager is director.
Right.
And experience architect is technical director, and then XD and SD and ID and GD. And please place the triangle. Please show up.
Next slide.
Yes.
Oh.
And we place each row wrapping each other. And you're talking about how manage each other. PM has its PM as a representative of the customer. So they control the goal of that project, and X-Way and XD are controlled by PM, but they can control the implementer developers, interaction developers, and graphic designer as a top-down model for management.
Right.
So do you actually hire for each of these roles? Like, if you've got is that experienced architect? Like, is he an experienced architect on every project, and do you have one per project, or do these roles? This is cool, by the way. But do these roles come together, or how does? I'm just thinking, like, in a practical, if I were to construct a team like this, like, how do I hire for these people? And some of these disciplines, like, I think you've represented it well. They kind of overlap. And how do you? I don't know. Do you always have? I should slow down.
Okay. Please.
Do you always hire for? Do you always have one person in that role, and he's always in the same role on every project?
Of course, it depends on the project size, but we should hire for each role for each guys, for one guys for one roles. But for very small project, XA guy and XC guy is the same guy.
Okay.
Yeah. But we have a different team in the development team, and XA guys and XD guys are different. So usually we hire from the system side world for the XA guys. XA guys are from the design world usually. So, but they want to do something with opposite side. From system side, I want to do something with design.
Right.
Yes, this intent is very important. It is very important. Yes, I think so.
Okay. We talked a lot now about like overall workflow, like at a very high level. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about a few of the more concrete parts of that. So a traditional problem, like in traditional application development, you have the problem, people create stills in Photoshop and then pretty much lose control, designers lose control of the visual design at that point because really somebody else needs to implement all that and actually make it work. So now with technologies like Flash and WPF and Silverlight, designers can have control much deeper into the development process than they could before. So how do your interfaces look like between what designers do and what developers do? And how do you make sure that they don't step on each other's toes and that they work together productively? So what are your interfaces and how do you make sure that everybody is playing safe, when you're working on real deliverables and real production assets?
Some of our Flash designers and motion designers actually are within what we're called the creative group now. They used to be traditionally in the quote-unquote technology group and front-end developers, but now, because exactly what you said, they're actually housed now more in the creative group. Which sort of brings, again, another set of interesting, because I think there's sort of a cultural shock also. The Flash developer is someone who tends to think much more in terms of the logic of the application, and obviously the look and feel as well, and the creative designer tends to think of the application more in terms of the emotional value, the impact that it would have on a particular experience. So it's interesting to see how that negotiation is actually happening in the creative group at the MIX08 Flash. That's basically the model we've been using recently.
Yeah, I think we've got a similar moment where, we have a lot of Flash developers who previously were in our technology group, and suddenly our technology group is much more around building the actual thing instead of building a simulation to give to our partner for them to go do something with. And that's made it to where a lot of our Flash developers, who actually what they do a lot of is they do a lot of simulation making, and they do it super fast, and they do it at the same time we're actually writing real code. They're slowly getting migrated probably into the design organization. They're out of the technology group. And a little bit of that has to do with the fact that basically everything they do when it comes to most of their day-to-day work is probably throwaway. Like that's not going to be the thing that gets deployed. That's the thing that sort of validated some of the design, and it sort of went into some testing and things. When it comes to PC software, like desktop software, mobile software.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just one thing that just occurred to me when you said it, it's the throwaway aspect. Is the throwaway aspect that puts them in the design group?
No, I'd say it's the emphasis on a creative solution to something. They sort of act like these built-in binders for us to. They're pulling together creative motion studies, and they sort of sit side by side with what we have as these designers who do After Effects work. And every bit of the After Effects work, you can do an After Effects sort of animation study in a matter of minutes. You can do something in Flash in a matter of hours. You can do it in Blend in a couple of days. Still, sorry for us, maybe we're slow. And so just their speed and sort of the nature of them sketching so much is pushing them, where they want to be part of the creative organization, and that's sort of where they make sense in some ways.
So I can tell you a real world scenario of how this worked for us just recently. So I was working on a project where we needed to do a little, like a little flip. It was in Silverlight though, so we had to fake it, right? So we wanted to do the animation where well anyway. So little fake flip. The way that workflow went is I talked to my designer. I didn't think we could do it actually. I thought that it would look cheesy. So I told him, if you can make it look cool, I'll like integrate it, right? But so he put it together. So the workflow was he actually created 2 images of the content. These were just JPEGs. He animated those inside of Blend. So he created the animation in Blend, and then showed me that it actually looked really cool because he knows what he's doing. And then he handed that off to me. And then in this case, I was in the integration role. The cool thing is that we were actually able to reuse his animation. Now I didn't reuse the content, obviously. And this is a really concrete way to kind of explain one thing that an integrator does, which would be to sort of take what the creative guy had done and then turn it into something real. Yeah. The nice thing is this is a guy who is comfortable and familiar with Blend, not Flash. I can understand why Flash would be throwaway. It's nice that we can do it in Blend because that allows us to reuse that work.
I think the real challenge is handling the second integration, or second iteration, third iteration.
Right.
That's the real challenge here. And something we've been trying out on the last couple of projects is having at the end of what we call our discovery phase, where we've got some wireframes, we've got some early visuals, maybe some interaction comps. That's where we'll actually have kind of a deconstruction meeting where the designers, tech, even program managers, all the entire group actually go through a 1, 2, 3 day kind of technical summit to kind of deconstruct, break down the design. And really, it's more technology-led. The technology folks are leading the designers through looking at it through a different lens, so that when we go and do the next round of iteration, and it's in Blend, and they're working with a specific control instead of a total screen comp, they have some background and understanding of what it took to pull that component of that composite control, the flip, fade, whatever, out into something that they're going to work on individually and knowing how it fits back into the overall interaction design for the screen.
Meeting, those are fun meetings. They are literally kind of fun. But that has replaced a lot of specification and writing down, and we've just swapped it with these teardown meetings where we sort of look at wireframes and flows and things interaction designers have made, things that designers using After Effects have made, people in Photoshop, etc. And the latest technical prototype. There's this teardown meeting, and then there's a sort of dark room for a while where we talk about how it could actually be built, and then people walk away from that with generally a plan of action.
So I love the terms you guys are using for that are awesome. So you're calling it deconstruction and teardown, and I actually think that's a perfect name for it. We call them architecture meetings. Yeah. And so I'm curious to know how you guys deal with this, because we come out of an architecture meeting. Like if we go into an architecture meeting with strong comps, and especially if we've been able to do some motion studies ahead of time, we can. Oh, sorry. I'm excited about this stuff.
It's okay.
So if we can go into this kind of a meeting, an architecture or a teardown meeting with strong comps, strong motion studies or whatever, and we know what it is we want to build, that really puts us on a great path. And it works great with clients too. It gets everybody kind of on the same page about how and where we want to end. But I think the iteration thing that you brought up is a great point. Once you've done that, you're kind of on a course, and it can be hard to, this is software design, right? Or software implementation in general.
Yeah.
So how do you guys deal with that? Do you have any magic?
Once we come out of it with a plan? Well, I think in general, I would say one of the things that we come out of it with is we've broken down the design into some things that aren't hard-baked. There's sort of, it looks like we need a navigation window to do this kind of thing. And that's we have made a pretty decent commitment in some things like that. Other things like the aesthetic of it, that direction can change late. So
especially in Silverlight WPF, you have to put in.
Yeah. So there's some things that sort of are quasi commitment. There's some things that actually we try to come up with, and we say this is the direction, and we do get 2 weeks down it and say this is never going to work. It's just going to be too slow, or it's not going to scale to this stuff we have to support. So there's usually a sort of let's regroup a week later and make sure we're not insane moment.
Yeah, one of the deliverables that comes out of these tear down, or I call them deconstructing, I'd like the more technical term, it sounds cooler, deconstruction, is really a kind of a control inventory, and where we rate the level of complexity, base controls, composite controls, and that's where we're all kind of doing our own assessment of how hard it is to visually skin it, theme it, build the interactions, triggers. We're talking WPF, XAML, Silverlight stuff. And from a technical point of view, what's the integration complexity? That's really the key, especially on enterprise level projects where you're maybe working, like in our case, working with a client's existing API that may or may not be at a level of maturity. It's really assessing what's the potential risks of how hard it is to integrate this, especially in the more complex controls, things like data visualization, live mapping, things like that.
You brought up data. That's another just kind of interesting point. That's a great place to figure out your data model. Not just your model, but also kind of your data plan for the build phase of the app. Because a lot of times you're not building against live data, so if you need dummy data, so a lot of times we'll come out of that having better answers to that question.
Yeah. We find that this also depends a lot on the size of the project. So, for example, Blend is a fairly big software project, and it's like 400,000 lines of C# code and like another 80,000 lines of XAML or so. So in Blend we found also, because a lot of that stuff is generated dynamically, that the designers who worked on it have generally worked a lot on the style guide level, and that then the implementation of the style guide has been done either by PMs or by developers, just simply because a lot of that is generated dynamically and not statically. But you can actually open lots of parts of Blend in Blend and actually edit them, which is kind of cool. So designers can actually do that and have done that and still are doing that. On the other hand, we just built a smaller application that we also have available for download now, the Deep Zoom Composer, which is an application that allows you to make these images that you maybe have seen today in the keynote, that allow you to zoom in very, very deep into fractal images. And that's a small app that we had developed outside of Microsoft, at least the code. So we had basically the interaction design done pretty much and had it coded, but then basically our in-house designers have done all the styling and all the visual design of it right on the actual production code without any developers actually being involved in that, which worked very, very nicely. Again, that worked in this particular case. Robbie mentioned data, because a lot of that is data-driven, and it's all about creating data visualization rather than actual code, which is very nice.
I was thinking when you said size of it actually makes a huge difference. And also in the web dev world, CMS integration. Because a lot of the stuff that we imagine, that we concoct, think, imagine, dream, sometimes the content management systems that are out there, or most of the time, don't support it. So that's the other piece that it adds. Because I think there's another layer. So there's the layer of the front-end developer as we traditionally know, and then there's the CMS developers. And those, sometimes it's another sort of snag in the process, how to get from front-end developers to CMS template, like back-end template developers, and how do we actually get that piece? Because a lot of what we dreamt of is limited by what CMS can actually do and deploy, especially for very large enterprise-wide apps. Right. So I was wondering, when you talk about the tear up and deconstruction, I love that. How do we actually, when you have a CMS-driven project, how does that sort of work itself out?
Yeah, I think that process is really more about the UI and the user experience layer. We have those similar types of teardown or architecture meetings that go on behind the scenes that we don't involve the designers in, that look at data models and APIs and data services and interoperability, that kind of stuff. The designers don't want to be there for that. So yeah, but it's a similar process. We have to go through and validate. I think really it's when you're building the controls that make up a set of workflow or task in your application. There's going to be push on the data model. The designers, the user experience creators are going to want to push the platform to do things it may not be intended to do. That's where you have to go back and work with what you call your CMS or your technologists, technical architects to see what the opportunities are.
Have you guys tried to bring the CMS people earlier in the process?
Yeah.
Anyone?
We actually work with a lot of other data sources as well, and try to work with the owners of those right away to see, we really need this information to get a better user experience. And, you hope for the best. You hope that maybe they'll add those features for you, but you kind of have to wait and play with it.
Right. At the end of the day, sometimes you can make an investment and write your own transformation. So if the data in the source is not available to you as you want it, you can pony up the extra resources to spend the time to write a transformation engine to get it into that into the model.
Typically that tends to be what happens for us.
Yeah.
We tend to deal with custom data sources or data sources that kind of in quantities, not necessarily the same. For Silverlight and WPF stuff, we don't do a ton of like standard web or ASP.NET.
As we're venturing in some slightly more technical topics, how do you guys deal with source code control for designers and having designers work with source code control? Do you do it? Don't you do it? How does it work?
It's a big challenge, actually. I have to say, like, the different design groups work differently, and it depends on the scale of the project. In some cases, if it's small, they're just working locally on their file systems. Some of them tried to work with the Adobe tools to manage the visualization. Version Q. We work with Perforce because it has good binary support, but for the most part, that's a little more organic within our organizations. So I've yet to find the perfect tool.
Yeah, we check in binaries. I mean, so our designers use we use TFS, right? Team Foundation Servers, and we check in source. We check in XAML, right? Obviously, we check in XAML. Also, we check in resources that are XAML. So stuff that we're not necessarily consuming directly, but just stuff that we've created, assets. And then we check in binaries. So if we've got images or whatever, movies, that kind of thing. We'll check that in, although there's no versioning on it, obviously.
Yeah. Right. And, when I talk, when I go out to customers and talk with customers, especially in the enterprise world, I hear often, yeah, we really like the designers to work on the design stuff, but we really don't want them to check in directly into the production builds. Is that something that you encounter in your internal world? Or?
We've had success with that. It took a little bit of convincing the development team, but we ended up only checking in what was the final version. Like, this is what you're actually going to use in your build of the code, but not all of the hundreds of Photoshop files or video concept files. Those things were kept outside of that, just so we didn't bloat that structure.
I think you can solve a lot of those concerns by how you actually structure the project and break down the resources. If you, XAML and other declarative markup languages really offer that opportunity to split out the designer's concern from the technologist's concern, even in the same source file or how you break it apart. And so that's really a lot of that upfront discovery work that people in the role like myself, technical architect or kind of lead designer, work together to really set the right control structure at the early part of the project. If you wait until halfway into the first integration, you're hosed at that point and tried to break it up.
So when we engage with a client and we're talking about workflow, if you want to have a strong workflow in WPF, I'd say, tell me if you agree with these. 3 kind of principles that will guide you. One is strong component models. So think about components, like divide your work up into components. Don't try to build, use strong composition, I guess, is kind of the model there. Second thing is make data-driven application. So let the data or the model drive your application. And then the last bit is take advantage of templating, both data templating and control templating. And those 3 things, I think, all kind of work to exactly what you're saying, which is you really can keep what the designer does sort of in his domain. I mean, there's obviously crossover, but more and more you can keep what the developer does in his domain and what the designer does in his domain. And actually, the takeaway here is that a lot of what the designer does or the integrator does ends up being in the XAML, and the developers typically don't need to write a lot of XAML if you build it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So
I have a question for you, Chris.
Sure.
What are the constraints on your end to develop things that meet some of the needs we're talking about, especially at the conceptual level? Why isn't, you think, whether at Microsoft or the industry-wide, I mean, why isn't there applications that are good for early conceptualizing?
Yes.
And is it a development cycle? Is it a perceived not having a need out there? What do you think are the constraints for that?
So first of all, I mean, I think we're quite interested in that field, and it's an area that we're certainly looking into. But I think historically, it's just that traditionally we have, I think, all looked at user interfaces basically as something, you have basically a picture and you make it interactive. And really, as we're looking into the future, that's not what user interfaces are going to be. User interfaces are much more influenced by motion graphics, by very, very dynamic scenarios, by highly resizable applications because they need to work on all kind of form factors and display sizes. They need to deal with multi-touch devices like the Surface and other things. So fundamentally, this traditional view of a UI basically as a form or basically as something that outgrows a static image goes away. And that requires a totally different approach to conceptual design of things than what you have had traditionally, you know, where you traditionally could argue something like Visio or HTML or PowerPoint or a whiteboard works really well when you think statically, just breaks down when you think in a world where everything is heavily dynamic. And so that is why I think that basically there will be a lot of change in that space in the next few years.
And I think to our point, like the thing that we're doing in lieu of that is we're changing, since no one has a tool ready for that, is we're changing process because it takes all these disciplines to basically run all over each other in a semi-chaotic way to make something that is usable, meets requirements, you know, looks incredible, is buildable, you know, within and is feasible.
Yeah, no,
so right now it's process that's sort of getting us there. It's not a tool.
And we definitely have teams, you know, have stopped doing any prototyping work in Photoshop, you know, like conceptual design work, but instead use, you know, some compositing systems, be it Shake or be it After Effects or Combustion or name your favorite. And, you know, because so much is just about the dynamics of what you do and not about the static things. So we're almost coming to the point where we don't have a lot of time left for questions if we go on, because we couldn't go on forever on that. I just want to have one more question that maybe each of you can answer. Like, if you name, you know, like your 3 major pain points in workflow, what would these be?
Distributed team workflow has been the hardest for us. I think, you know, that's when you've got people all over the globe trying to work together. I wish there was better tools for that type of community working experience.
Yeah, but I would jump on that and say this model, this controlled chaos, people work together model is almost impossible with distributed teams. I mean, it requires like 3x the effort to get, because you have almost no documentation. You rely on these teardown meetings, you know, to happen consistently. You rely on people sitting next to each other. And so, you know, it's almost like we go with a different process if we start doing too much distribution.
Even though I don't think I'm looking for the diviner, I think there's a retooling of the people. That's a really tough thing. I think people need to be in a different information architects, interaction designers. It's hard to put yourself in a motion framework when you've been thinking statically for a long time. So the skills are there, but there's needs for retooling. And that's one thing. And the other thing, as I said, is tools for early concepting.
Okay, so I think this is a great break point to open the floor for questions. So we have microphones around, but maybe it works without as well.
My name is Ron Paddock, and I'm a software developer, and I build boring things like accounting applications and HR applications.
Nice.
I'd like to hear you guys comment. Do you build these types of things? And I'm not talking about the reporting and visualization of the reporting. I'm talking about the regular old screens where people sit down and take a customer service call. Do you think we're going to get any value out of this? And how do you see, how can we prepare for them?
I'll jump in. Yes, we do those. Yes, we have applied the same attempts at workflow, because it's not just about like, you know, I want a cinematic experience. You know, like somebody brought up like, how did we get to this wanting to change process and do designer developer workflow? My perspective on it is I've worked on like a lot of software projects that failed, like that got cut, that got stopped, that got scaled, that just didn't make it, you know. And so, you know, one of the reasons that I like moving this direction is that things are failing less often. Like things are making it, you know, whereas I'm used to, and those things include HR applications and accounting, you know, tabulators. So like, yes, you know, if in my mind, we would apply the same thing if we got given a similar project. If we wanted it to succeed and we had a team sort of located together and we had a client who was willing to accept a little risk in terms of change of process of normal software development, then yeah, we'd do it.
So, and kind of an interesting observation, I think that a lot of people discount the value that comes so I'm just talking about experience in general, like the level of experience that you can achieve in enterprise. And I think that a lot of people discount the value that can come to an enterprise kind of application from like a solid design, even things like motion design. And I mean, if you think about it, it's funny, we spend, like the average person spends, say if you spend 20 hours a week on a computer, probably 16 of those are spent at work, right? Like most of us spend our time on a computer at work, or a large percentage of it. And yet it's those applications that tend to get ignored by the design community. I think there's a huge opportunity for improvement. And you'd be surprised, like you look at a forms application, you'd be surprised at the efficiencies that can be gained by, looking at new ways to handle input or new ways to visualize data and things like that. So I would love to talk to you about, opportunities there are to innovate and think about, that kind of software on maybe a different spectrum or a different strata. Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity for innovation, though, in enterprise.
But I just saw one, because I'm going to disagree with you on this, because I think there is a, debate. I think that also what happens in your field is that also I think there's a horizon of user experience design that we'll be taught. We're building things for people to use it, and I think some of these applications in the HR world, I think there is still a need to bring user experience design into the picture as well. So I think that what I'm trying to say that I feel a little more pessimistic, because I think it's not simply about the coding and how the processes are developed, but also there's one in terms of mindset that I think a lot of these software-based rely on people training to use the applications as opposed to making applications easy to use from the get-go.
But Marcelo, but I think that's I think is the point. Design is not just about making snazzy visuals, but it's also about just having great interaction design, and that applies to a form application at least as much as to anything else.
Well, are you disagreeing with me now?
Sorry?
I'll say, sorry. Here's another level of debate, because the end of your question was asked, what can you do to prepare for it? In some of the enterprise engagements that we're working on, it's more about the application architecture of moving away from a form-based model where it's function-based from screen to screen, but it's about task-based models. So you're using these rich interactive technologies to achieve a task-based, user is walking through a series of actions to achieve that outcome, and this is where the user experience design is going to play key in this. It's not about laying out text boxes and combo boxes on a data grid. It's more about breaking down what is the person X in one department and person Y in another department using the application in different task scenarios. What is going to meet their needs for their specific, repetitive function, basically, in an enterprise scenario.
Yeah. Let's take some more questions.
Can you say a little bit about the role of information architecture, maybe also as it relates to enterprise applications?
Yes, in my experience, that we are. It's actually, I would ask Mark and Rob and everybody actually about this, because one of the challenges is that in our world, Avenue, A-Razor, Fish, the enterprise world is the realm of information architects. This is where I feel information architects have the most pull, because really understanding complex processes, workflows. This is sort of like, it's almost like our native environment for a lot of the old school information architects. Then there's this other piece, which is not enterprise, and in which there's a lot of creative tension between people who come from a quote-unquote visual background and people who come from a sort of more logic, workflow-ish sort of mindset which are in the information architecture world. So I feel that there's going to be, and I think his question actually I think signals that a lot of people migrating from the visual world into the enterprise world to make that universe of activities and things more pleasant, more pleasurable, to make the work environment something that is actually user-friendly. So people can work better and people can be more productive at the end of the day. So I think there is a process in which we're no longer talking about enterprise, but we really talk about the workplace. So, and I think the introduction of the user in that space transforms enterprise thinking in the thinking of improving conditions at the workplace. And this is where I think that's where the big change, as I see it, actually happen in that space.
I have to agree as well. I mean, I think I've worked on several enterprise projects internally for some large companies. And when you have a better user experience, the tools are faster, you're saving time, and then I think you're also building more trust in the company. So when you actually make them feel reliable, like they know they're getting what they want out of it, it's easy for them to use. it always just helps morale and how much time they might have been wasting before. So you're saving money in the end.
Was your question about what's the role of information architects?
Yeah, information architecture.
Yeah. So I'd say we have our special term for that. We call it analytical design or design analyst. I would say that somebody brought up that things are changing. We had this moment where sort of on all programs, it's sort of the domain of the design analyst or information architect got bigger and bigger. It was like they sort of owned everything. They were the visionary. They owned the micro level. They owned the spec. They owned the wireframes. They did all the workflows. And we just had rafts of these people everywhere. And I'd say over the last 2-3 years again, we've seen like these other disciplines sort of come up as well. Like these sort of tweeners or diviners, these sort of technologists who sort of found their way side by side with these people. That's created a little discomfort and just process change. How's this different than what we've normally done? Also, the designers have also taken on interaction design because we have these visual designers who are doing simulations in After Effects or Flash that sort of actually really dramatically affect the interaction design. So all of a sudden, it's not sort of a top-down process that we had for like 3 or 4 years doing big web applications. It is, it is everyone running at the same time, and the interaction designer is the one who's sort of the mortar between a lot of these things a lot of time. So that role is one of the most in flux, going from giant, the overseer of everything, to sort of the glue between them. So for us, that's a pretty big change.
Cool. There was a question there in the back that didn't get it.
I'm one of the Superman you guys talked about.
I'd like to talk to you after this.
Several like pre-WPF views and work with coders and designers and everybody. And the reason we found the Superman come out is lack of resources. One guy steps up and says, I want this to happen, so it happens.
Yeah.
You kind of said it, you can fight it through process, but the process costs money. How do you overcome that? But you just dovetailed pretty nice with your last comment too about interaction designers versus interface designers versus graphic designers. How do you convince your boss of the return on investment, or just don't have the resources?
I'm happy to. You want me to answer it? I'd love to. Okay. We don't have to convince our boss as much as we have to convince the client that it's worth the extra, people to be on board from the beginning. And so for us, it's a little bit of evangelism about the benefits that we're going to have by having 3 or 4 people on this program at one time. Like what Ken said, though, some programs don't support 8 people going full time for a year. Some programs support 2 to 3 people, a few months. And so on those, that's where we start coalescing, skill sets. And it might turn out that we do have a visual designer who's also a really good simulator. So that sort of becomes 2 roles. And we have a developer who really cares about, on a specific technology, really cares about end user experience. And so those 2 can form the SWAT team and go do it. But that becomes a little more, we start trying to, we've teased out the things that we think it takes to make a team. And then we start looking for ways to collapse that down.
I think we actually kind of almost use our process as Superman in training, because as you go through one or 2 of these cycles, you pick up, technologists pick up things from the designers and vice versa. So the process kind of feeds on itself. And
whereas when we've done like the handoff stuff for so long, you just get better at doing your little thing. So by having everyone run on top of each other, we end up with these hybrids that can do more than one thing suddenly.
Yeah. I think like when I started doing video editing almost 20 years ago, the people who were doing video editing would just do video editing, and they wouldn't touch effects work or compositing work at all. And I think today this is much more common that video editors actually do compositing work as well. And I think a similar thing is starting to happen in the design community. If you want to be successful in making great user experiences, you cannot just have skills very, very deep in one very narrow area. I think you need to have a wider skill set. Do you need to know everything? Do you need to be the perfect hybrid that is the perfect developer and the perfect designer? No. But I think you certainly can't allow yourself, to be stuck in one very, very small niche if you want to be successful in an art that, by definition, is broad. User experience is broad by definition, and therefore I think the most successful people in that space will be the people who have broad sets of skills. That doesn't mean that we don't also need specialists, but I think the stars in that business are going to be people who are a little broader than just pure specialists.
Right, but I think that's actually, I want to ask a question actually to the audience actually. There are people here who have experience in other fields, like movie, for example. There's this, at one point we thought that we could actually have people from other industries who are used to motion. They were able to help us in the process of creating better motion prototyping, for example. Had anyone come from the movie industry, for example, or any other industry would have anything to say besides you?
Okay, I shut up.
No.
Well, you talked about large projects, you talked about small projects, how much personnel, different resources are assigned.
Yeah.
How do you price that to the client? Are there metrics that you're using? Are you breaking down the project by piece? And you're looking at the different personnel that you have. What are your approaches to approaching the client on, here's the same cost? What makes a $100,000 project? What makes a $1 million project?
I think there's, I think I would advocate an iterative process for a client that I have a relationship with.
Brand new client.
A brand new client, I probably be more conservative. And depending on the appetite, a brand new client, I think there's some merit in a waterfall and being more careful and treading the waters much more carefully. For a client that you know, I think there's a relationship there. There's trust built in. And I think there's less risk on both parts, so you can actually go and become more adventurous. That's my...
Yeah, that's totally true. The other thing that we will do, we will do an upfront sort of scoping exercise. You know, it's like just call it discovery or something, where we will come back. You know, the idea is they tell us the thing, we give some approaches, we come back with what we think would be the best. And at that, you know, during that meeting where it's sort of this is our approach to how we're going to go into design and deliver this thing, we'll have a process and we may show some prototypes of what we could do if we had this appropriately staffed team. And we'll say, this is what we say is the best way for you to hit success. And a lot of times it isn't giant team for 18 months. A lot of times it is, we think it's going to be best with, 2 to 3 people, sort of strung out for a long time because we want to iterate on this a long time. Sometimes it's no, we kind of know the end game and we're working from a date-driven release, so we want to put the right team in place. And if you don't do that, then you're probably, there's a high chance of failure, not hitting the success that we want, or the date.
Are you typically looking at the pieces like parts of e-commerce, parts that are going to be CMS, parts going to be looking at X number of forms that we have and go, well, we figure a form that takes about 8 hours to design, 5 hours of coding. I mean, is there a metrics-based approach you're using, or is it if you have to know what the client needs ahead of time, that discovery period has to be in depth to find out what they need.
Yeah, that's what I go back to the client's appetite, the style, and also the needs. Sometimes when the client has really a fairly aggressive timeline, sometimes the iterative process is the best way because you can condense things and you put people and you get the work done. So I think the scoping exercise continues to be the same. It's just that it's all about, and I know it's sort of like trying to not give you a straight answer, but it's really depending on the relationship you have with the client.
It's a chicken and egg. I mean, you don't know. You haven't designed the thing yet, so you don't really know how much work it's going to be. So, we try to put some rough shape to it. We think we can build something similar to this. If you squint, we show them like a picture or two, it might look like this. And this is probably 6 months of work, we need to work with your team. Let's say it's a client who has developers, and we need support from a couple of architects, your 2 or 3 system engineers, and we think that based on our experience, it can happen.
Last follow-up. Do you usually build more with the value-based approach, thinking, the value to this client, this is a $500,000 project. It may only cost us $75,000 or $100,000 resources, but we'll save that $500,000. Are you going for the value-based approach on cost, or are you looking more at your cost and just marking up a percentage?
Usually, for us, it usually goes the other way, where we'll look at the opportunity and say, we've got this one opportunity with this client, but we know there's other opportunities coming on later on, so we can do this one. We can take a smaller cut on this one, knowing there's a larger opportunity. Typically, it goes that way, not the other way, for us at least.
I would agree.
Maybe let's follow up on that later, so that we can take some more questions. Yeah.
One of the things with what we've been seeing with design, and we've seen some of the business models and management models around design, is that while the end user experience is great, we've got to do it. It certainly adds complexity to the development process. So how do you build in nimbleness for applications, or for maybe doing things such as globalizing applications as part of the design process?
We try to do that with standards if we can. You know, we try to make sure everything's componentized and standardized. And I think it's part of the challenge because it depends on like the budget and the scope and the time frame of how you can plan for that. And in some cases, you just have to not do it in the first version and then hope that you're going to be able to come back in the phase 2 and phase 3.
The scoping exercise is critical for that, though, because you come out of the scoping exercise typically with an idea of sort of the breadth of the project.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of times kind of I don't know what to say, but the throwawayness of the project. And so with that, by going through that scoping exercise, you know, this is like a demo, or this is like a 3-month web project, or this is, somebody's foundational application for their business. And so coming out of we call it envisioning, the scoping exercise. Coming out of that, we know what our investment is going to have to be in what we call infrastructure, things like localization, accessibility, kind of the fundamentals. And then the good news is that in the technologies that we're using, especially in WPF, there's a very strong structure, kind of underlying structure for how you do that. So it's a known quantity to some extent. Like we know roughly how to handle localization in a project, or roughly like what we get in terms of accessibility. I think you're talking about nimbleness kind of on a larger scale too.
We do it, and also like on the same. Like, part of what we do is recommend a technology solution, and one of the things that will come into is how, like you were saying, what kind of project is this this is for 12 months and that's all that they need a shelf life for? Is this, the beginning of their next 5 years? And those things will massively affect what Robert and the architects put together is we think this is the right technology for you. It's going to scale, it's going to support all these additional things eventually, localization, globalization, et cetera. If it's not, then we just say, well, we could do this much more efficiently with a different technology. Sometimes.
It's not just the technology itself, it's what you're getting at is the extensibility model for not just localization, but just future versioning and feature enhancement. And the analog to the deconstruction process is the reconstruction process, right? And that's where all the cards are on the table. Localization, globalization concerns, cultural changes, business changes. It's not just about the kind of the tactical aspects. It's really about, so in different markets, does this application have to serve slightly different purposes, especially like on a web content. You have to have targeted audiences, and it may not be global. It may be sales channel based, and so all of those cards are on the table. We have another role that we bring in as a strategist that kind of sits outside of the design and technology tasks and really looks at those concerns and then feeds that into people like myself that really focus on breaking it down into pieces that can serve multiple purposes depending on the channel, the audience, et cetera.
Just as a follow-up, typically it happens where the customer wants it done as simple as possible the first time, probably just for the US market, no accessibility, doesn't mind about anything like that. Then the project becomes a success, and then they want all this, they want you to add all these things. Now, is that something that you will have designed in from day one?
Absolutely. Yeah, we basically have a process where we bake that in because at least in our agency model, I mean we're looking at long-term relationships, and we want to use that as a seed to engage further. And so if we don't do it, it's going to be a bad situation if the client comes back and really did say, okay, my requirements are I want to do X, Y, and Z, and then you cut it off at that, and then they come back and then we look like, well, you didn't, and they asked for those things and you didn't design it that way the first time, and then, so you have to bake that into your process.
Yeah,
I think though the problem often is when the client doesn't ask for it in the first place, and then you have to make the decision if you spent the extra money for it or not. And I think that's a trade-off that you can't make, in a general manner. You have to do that on a case-by-case basis.
To Robbie's point, though, that the technologies that we're talking about here are making it more efficient. So we're saving money.
And also the things we talked about earlier around workflow, like things like compositional models, data-driven models, those, using templating, those things are also kind of leading toward best practices for scalability, nimbleness, those, even things like accessibility factor into that. So I think that these following best practices that happens.
I completely agree. The one thing that continues to lag behind is CMS. Content management systems usually are a big hurdle in terms of building things that are really scalable, because the features that you have not thought today might be possible from a data model perspective, but from the CMS perspective you pick and you select the templates to build, might be very hard to build. So that's where, and clients have a very hard time to understand the CMS that they actually buy. And it's usually an Achilles heel in terms of building these scalable products.
Mm-hmm. So we have about 5 minutes left at our current speed of answering. That means probably one more question. Go faster.
Do you guys, in different disciplines, as you're moving through the project, you have deliverables, and you're
Because they have dual audiences?
We usually present the same, especially from the UX standpoint, the pre-design. It's the same stuff, like the same documents. Sometimes maybe our own notes might be removed, but otherwise it's going to be the same wireframes, the same markups in there.
We're not finding in our engagements that it comes out into two audiences. Through this iterative process and working with the client, we're evangelizing and socializing our design and our technology solution as we go along. And so there's not a point where we reach this, okay, we've got to all get in a room and believe in it. It's a slow developing process that occurs, and you gain that trust as you go through small deliverables, small proof of concepts, small check-ins, things like that.
Yeah, and it's been like on the iterative thing. Like we've also moved from agencies don't like too much client contact traditionally, right? It's like it's so much noise that it's like we can't get anything done. We're in meeting with you guys all the day. Like, that's kind of the traditional thing, where it's just you get overloaded with that. And so you sort of put up buffers between it so you can get work done. We've actually, one of the things we've been doing, although that runs against what we want is light, nimble, quick iterations and all these things. So on our teams, we've been changing that, and now we're in contact, twice a day, with these meetings, these 20-minute meetings that go on. Everyone's all hands on board. And for, internal, for our consultancy, that was a, big, red flag. They think this is going to, slow us down. The clients are all over. Of course, they love it. But it's turned out it's done the opposite. Things are faster. We don't go off track as much. The client is totally transparent of the work that's going on. And there's less of this, the engineering team is seeing one thing and they think we're building one thing, and the C-level folks and the marketing, they think we're building this other thing. So that has had this complementary effect of killing that effect.
We're in the same boat. In fact, an interesting perspective that I think is something we're adopting is that that our job as designers is actually to solve business problems, not necessarily to make business problems prettier. And so by engaging with the client regularly, we're way more capable to do that. If you kind of have a monolithic solution that you want to hand off at the end of a long design process, there's a good chance you're going to get a lot of it wrong. So our goal is to engage the client often, and it makes us way more successful.
Yeah, traditionally, the client is part of the team. They're there all the time. We want them to be.
It depends on the client too. Like entertainment industry clients, I don't recommend to having, because they really need more polished products when you deliver to them. If you're, and I'm not saying the enterprise clients are less picky, but if you have an enterprise client, you can actually engage them more in a day-to-day process, because I think there's more of a hands-on. So I would say think of the industry of the client, what the culture you're delivering to.
I'm talking about when you're dealing mostly with marketing organizations. So the
Yeah.
CMO is your client. They're a brand, and you're working with their brand.
Right.
You're bringing it to the web or whatever, or a different experience. That sort of handoff, what they expect to see is highly polished. And they also want to deal with you like they deal with their other agencies. Mm-hmm. So
That's
they
true.
want to have design meetings where they just look at comps.
Right.
And then go off for 2 weeks and talk about it and tell you they loved it, and then tell you that purple is the color.
We usually have some pretty interesting meetings with those folks early on and say that how many of those engagements have gone successfully. We think that your behavior on this thing has caused some of that. So how about we invite you a little more into this process for this project? And the two that we've done just in the last few months, it's totally different. All of a sudden the CMO is like, wow, this is how it works. I see. They're not much more invested. They're still, it's 5 minutes, basically the day of them seeing it, but it's changed them.
And usually the chief marketing officer types, they're much more concept driven than necessarily application or interaction driven, which is changing for them as well. So
Totally.
they're really realizing that the experience is the brand many times.
Yeah.
So you can't simply pull the two things apart from each other. And it's a cultural shift also happening with these folks, not only with us.
Yeah.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you very, very much for coming, and I hope you have a great week.